Cool. Looks good?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Well, I'll try to hit, and then I'll try to stop you a couple times for questions, or if you want to stop me, just let me know, and we'll try to use our time as best as we can. So here's what we'll do: is I'll just to introduce myself. This is me and my family. I'm currently doing PhD work out at Durham University, so I'm trying to finish that up this year. And you can see that I'm an amazing father by the fact that my son doesn't have a shoe on here in our kind of big family portrait. And this, sadly, is Hollywood Beach. We went there last October, and I don't think that this same beach is here, sadly, anymore. So hopefully this sand will get back. But this is them. I got 2 kids, and my wife is a literature and philosophy professor. And then my kids are in 1st and 3rd grade, and they're really fun little kids. So I work at Dallas Theological Seminary, and so I do kind of a lot of communications and code work and build some online ed software for them. And one of the fun things I got to do recently was take a lot of this online ed software and open source that, and now that's part of WordPress. And recently I saw that it showed up on StarWars.com. So this little video player thing that we made for the seminary is now part of StarWars.com. And so that's it. That's my whole presentation. I'm done. that was,
wow,
to me, that was the coolest thing. Yeah. And so I also do some stuff that's more Bible-y. So I make some Bible software, which isn't that special other than that it's made to be kind of smuggled into countries where you're not supposed to have that kind of thing. So those are fun, kind of more like explicit things for the kingdom, whereas the other stuff about just making a good video player that anybody can use, I feel like both of those things are important. So it doesn't have to be this kind of like Christian-y stuff like this, but it can also be StarWars.com stuff, just making video work. So I know that's what most of you are doing involved in that. But again, I love the Bible stuff. Since I'm down in Texas, we learned that that Greek and Hebrew has second-person plurals in it that we don't have in English. And so I made y'allversion.com to show where all those second-person plurals are. And if you happen to be from Chicago, you can change it to say "use guys," or if you're from Pittsburgh, you can change it to say "yins." So it'll adapt to your context. And then I, like most of us, like to play with recurrent neural networks and other AI stuff. So I fed it a bunch of popular worship music and had it generate this lovely song. So I thought we'd all just sing this together. Just kidding, we're not going to sing it because I can't sing. But so probably like most of you guys like to just play around with this kind of stuff. This is my favorite 80s GIF because that would probably be what I would have looked like in middle school if I was doing this kind of stuff. So anyways, so I know you guys talked a little bit about faith and work, and in my view, I always think of the sort of layers of faith at work of being just the moral thing where you need to be good and not do immoral things at work. And I think that's an important layer. But then the next thing people usually talk about is actually sharing your faith with your coworkers, and explicitly you're there really for that purpose. And I think that's a good thing to do, but I don't think that's your necessarily, I wouldn't want to make that your primary purpose for work. And then I think there's also this idea that you can do work that you make money that you give to the church, or you make, Christian stuff like I talked about before. But I really think there's this layer that all of us really want to get to, or we say any work that we do, honors God and honors the Creator. And then that gives us the capacity to be one of the people in our workplaces that can think about, ethical uses of technology or whatever work we're doing. So again, I think those first 3 layers are great, but I think, moving us to that 4th layer where we're honoring God with what we do. And I think we see that as we start looking at the scriptures a little bit more. But what I usually do when I'm with people that aren't in the tech world, I just kind of give them some examples. And this is the funny slide where everything was in harmony between God and man. And then, Apple comes along and invents all these devices, and we all feel distracted and connected and all that stuff. And so we're wondering how to deal with it. And so I think these lovely images of, this little girl getting a 3D printed arm and just really being able to, grow with that is beautiful. The thing with this little boy who's hearing his father for the first time with a cochlear implant is just so powerful. And I think it recalls the language of Jesus when he says that you'll know I'm here because the deaf can hear and the blind can see. And so I can't remember if we talked about what one of you did biomedical type work, but that this kind of stuff is just an amazing, I think, testament to the human creativity. But of course, there's also the kind of mundane uses of technology that are just fun. And sometimes it's just enjoyable to make cool stuff. And it doesn't really have to be all that special. It's just cool. But Experian loses our data. So there's the bad stuff. When we lived in England, we saw this disturbing PSA about, kids and technology. We all know that, we want to protect our children from pornography, but we know that they're going to see it. So I know that my kids will see pornography while they're still at our house at some point. And so we're trying to prepare them more for that reality rather than, it's not that we don't want to protect them, but we just know this is the world that we live in. Like if you lived in first century Ephesus, there would be giant, penises everywhere. And we live in 21st century America, and there's going to be pictures that they're going to see, and they need to be prepared for that reality. There's the terrible, texting and driving epidemic that we have. And I've actually been playing with iOS's don't disturb while driving feature. So this is on iOS 11. And I noticed it does something really, really interesting. So when you're driving, it's the screen over here on the left. So it just says you won't receive notifications, so you don't get text, and it will bounce text back to people saying that you're driving. But if you try to press like the home button, it brings up this screen on the right. And you notice anything interesting about the choices that it gives you down the lower right?
Yeah.
Forces you to lie.
Right.
Yeah, it forces you to lie. Exactly. You're dead on. And it's really, really fascinating because I know, I remember my wife was driving us on a trip, and I was like, yes, I can truthfully click this button and do some emails. But then, inevitably I'm at a stop sign and I'm like, well, I'm in park, I'm not really driving, and then there's that moment where I really believe that I need to do it, and I press it and I lie to it. And we've been conditioning ourselves to do this by clicking, I agree to terms, and that I read the terms and conditions for years. But I think this interesting thing about the kind of persuasive computing and trying to help us, take enough steps with our Fitbit. But of course, there's that guy that's like shaking the Fitbit in front of the TV, trying to get enough points. So it's our relationship with technology often shows us something about our soul, right, deep down inside. And even best intended features like this, I guarantee you, in about 3 weeks, everyone's just going to be clicking "I'm not driving" whenever they want, And if I was the guy at Apple that had the stats on this, it would just be fascinating to watch. So. And we won't talk about this a ton. We could, but there's the posthumanist movement that you've probably seen. There's actually a Christian posthumanist movement. If you ever want to look that up, if you happen to look up Christian posthumanism, I think .org, and you look at their basic principles, I would bet that you would almost agree with every single one of their principles. It's really, really interesting stuff. But it's probably about half believers in the sense that we would know it, and half Mormons maybe in another sense. Which might not be surprising if you know much about kind of Mormon eschatology. But these questions about, it's fine to put glasses on, but is there a point at which we should stop? And then, if you're developing AIs, you may wonder what to do when they begin to ask questions, right, about things. And what do you really think about the nature of what does it mean to be saved, and what is the kingdom, and who can be a part of it? All of these interesting questions about what we create. So you often see people out there talking about how they're very excited about technology, or they're very scared about technology. And the usual kind of result is people say, well, yeah, there's good and yeah, there's bad, but the assumption is that technology itself is just neutral, that it's kind of just a conduit that we can put things through. And what really matters is that we want to just use it correctly, right? And that's really the only thing that matters, is that we're using it in a way that honors God. And I think that that's a great thing to do, to use it to honor God. But I think what we want to be particularly equipped to do is to see that whether we're using it for good or for bad, there's these kind of non-neutral effects that happen. And so that it really isn't very helpful to talk about technology as neutral. So I'm going to try to walk through like 10 little points. And since we're all people who think it's funny to start with 0, we're actually going to get 11 because we're going to start with 0. But I think the first thing just to kind of remember is this idea that technology isn't ever really neutral in any meaningful sense. And a just very, very simple illustration of this was probably about 15 years ago. I did work as a youth pastor really, really briefly. And so I asked the church to give us a projector. And, just in theory, I would use it for good and not for bad. We didn't want to watch any R-rated movies or any PG movies from the 80s, which feel like R-rated today. And you can make a big mistake if you try to share those as a youth pastor. But, what I found out was that, half the kids brought their Bibles before, and the other half we'd like pass out Bibles to, but as soon as we brought the projector in and we started showing the scripture up on screen, what do you think happened?
No more Bible. No more Bible.
Yeah, right. So they don't bring it. And this is kind of what I mean by saying that you can use technology for good all you want, but sometimes there's these unintentional things that happens when you use it. Now, at the same time, if you think back into kind of like church history and how long people have been, believers, really no one brought Bibles to church for at least the first, probably 1800 years of the church. So when the printing press comes in the 1500s or so and starts making Bibles cheaper, it's still not cheap enough for like the average person to buy one. And then in the 1800s, paper gets cheap enough where like a family can buy a Bible. And then in the 1950s, the publishing industry really starts taking off, and you start seeing all these different Bible versions, and you see ones that are like the teen study Bible and the women's study Bible and the cat lovers Bible and all these different types that are out there. And so the kind of interesting thing about the projector is that when you use it, then all of a sudden, instead of everybody having their own personal Bible that's all about them and their personal Jesus walk and all that stuff, now we kind of have this recollection of going back to an era in a pre-literate time when people actually, were working with the same text at the same time. So this is all I mean by technology not being neutral, is that all these other things happen whenever we implement it. And kind of being aware of these things is one of the things that we can bring to the table, not just the morality thing. Because, even in your workplace, someone might say, oh, well, you're the Christian guy. All you're going to care about is the moral stuff. And you do. But at the same time, you want to be thinking through some of these other deeper societal implications. This is a simple thing in church, but how it has to deal with, the poor and justice and race and all those different issues. So at home, the taking a single device all in one, that kind of changes the way that our family life operates, right? And it's very, very helpful, but we have to explain things to our kids that a previous generation might not need to do. So again, this is this idea that we can be using it for good, but our family life has some non-neutral effects with bringing technology into our home. And you've probably all seen this when Pope Benedict was elected. There's just that one person rocking the flip phone in the corner. And then, you get to the more recent cool Pope, and now the flood of devices are there. So things are, changing pretty rapidly, and people have just a lot of questions about these things. And sometimes we make a prediction about where technology is going to go, and it turns out that doesn't really work out. So we'll see how well, Face ID goes and all those kinds of things in the future. But, we know some of these things are on the horizon, and we want to be kind of at the table thinking through the ethics. You've probably all seen the kind of the classic trolley problem of, if a car has to crash, which crowd should it crash into, and deciding, and those kind of algorithms are important questions for, I think, believers to be at the table on. And then, of course, all the fun technology that has to do with the future of babies, and even with CRISPR modifying people as while they're adults. So classically, when people are thinking about kind of a more of a philosophical approach to technology, they're usually asking this question of whether or not people are able to be in control, or whether or not technology is the thing that's actually driving society. And so along that spectrum, the language that people usually use is instrumentalism, is the simple idea that, hey, people are in complete control. We control the destiny of the future. And then a determinism would be more like, well, technology is really the primary driving force of society, and it's what makes us do things, and makes things like, it's the thing that determines who's going to get elected in a given presidential election, and that kind of thing. And then depending on if you kind of have a positive or negative view, people fit on these different poles. So some of the futurists that would talk about technology taking us into kind of a futuristic realm, like Kurzweil, who would say that this is eventually going to give us kind of immortality, that would be in this positive determinism. Down on the negative side of things are the people that would be more believing that, eventually we're going to go to nuclear war and battle. Neil Postman is a fantastic technology thinker, but he tends to be, leans down in the pessimism. And sometimes over the optimism, you might have just like the church that just says, let's embrace everything and put it in here. Or, this is kind of like the quintessential tech company, position where technology is always good and people are in control and don't worry about it. And then sometimes you have the church folks on the other side of things that are saying technology is scary because there's, bad things happening. So this is kind of the spectrum that we are on. And what we want to try to do is have some type of middle way where Christian theology allows us to take into account both of these things, the power of technology kind of in a deterministic way, but also human agency on the other side of things. So if you have the idea that technology is just an instrument, that nothing really matters about it, that's just a neutral conduit, that would be kind of ignoring some of the subtler things about technology. The other side would be that technology is so powerful that it takes over everything. And so we want to kind of chart this sort of middle way in between, where we see technology as, God-given, but we also recognize some of its transformative power. So what I'm going to try to do in the next little bit here is just talk about that God-given side and then that transformative side and work on both of those. So this is that definition again. I think the other one is just to think about, the ways that people define technology. So if you look that up in a dictionary, you'll get all kinds of root word things, but really, one of the primary things that's important to think about technology is not just modern, but that technology in the past is everywhere, and then it becomes invisible to us over time because we just kind of start to ignore it. And so I love this from Alan Kay's old definition of here's.
Wait, here for a second.
Okay.
Oh, there.
Okay.
We got it.
What does he say?
Part of what he means is that you don't think of technology, if you're familiar with it, you're appear before your eyes, it becomes a foreign thing.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I'm working on a laptop right now, and my kids constantly come up to it and try to touch it. They think it's broken because they've been used to screens or to be touched, right? And so they're not used to a non-touch screen world. And so Douglas Adams, the guy who wrote the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, he kind of expanded on this and said, everything before you were born is just stuff. That's the way the world works and just what you expect of it. And you never question it. And everything from 0 to 35 is the cool stuff you can build your career on. And then 35 plus is the destruction of society and degradation of our kids' minds that we worry about. So, if you look at history and you think about all these things that didn't exist at some point, like clocks or agriculture or whatever, depending on when you were born, all these things are not technology for you. And then there's an era of things that you were introduced to that are really cool for you, and maybe a set of things that you learn. And depending on what industry you're in, you maybe kind of learn as a second language. And then of course in our homes, sometimes we get this sort of generational conflict based on how people understand things. And maybe in this room we all kind of get social media, but maybe don't get Snapchat as much unless we have like a younger kid who wants to talk to us. So, these things can come along and they'll feel foreign in a different way, but it's just worth orienting ourselves to think about when you're talking with people and you say technology, they might have a different idea in mind. And that when we're thinking about how to shape our lives in a way that is honoring to God, we may need to think about more than just our phones. We may need to think about, our cars and transportation and how we operate our cities and all of those things. Some of the things that become unquestioned. And I live down in Dallas where everybody, there's giant highways and no public transportation and a bunch of trucks. And those trucks were certainly useful in Houston a couple weeks ago, but a lot of times they're just gas guzzling things, but we don't question them down here because that's just the way things are. So it's always worth going back and questioning all of these things in the past. So on the God-given side of things, I think one thing just to reiterate with ourselves and with people is that technology, I think, is a definite good, full stop in the biblical story. And there are some thinkers, like I said, Neil Postman, I think he's fantastic, but in his view, and he's coming from a Jewish faith perspective, he would say that he doesn't think technology is something that God originally wanted. And some other thinkers, even Jacques Ellul, who's another kind of technology thinker, would say something really similar. And I don't think that they really have an accurate reading there of Scripture. Now, in the biblical story, we don't have direct references to modern technology, but I think as a whole, in the big story, we see a lot of that. So I'm doing the little kind of just creation, fall, redemption, restoration. There's other ways I know to tell the biblical story, but this is just a simple way that helps for here. I think for all of us as people working in creative things, and knowing that we are all male and female created in the image of God, seeing that the very first thing that we're introduced to God as is him as a creator, I think that gives me a lot of joy personally, just because it means that the things that I'm doing are image-bearing activities when I'm creating, because that's what we see of God first. And in fact, throughout history, people have pictured God and his creative work as being sort of this tool using God. And so when we use tools, I think that's part of our image-bearing thing. And we see this most succinctly in the garden, where in Genesis 2, when it kind of zooms down in, it opens up and it says that in the garden there weren't any trees or bushes or anything yet. And it said the two reasons for that was there was no rain, and the second reason for that was that there were no people yet there to cultivate and keep the garden. And so that word cultivate is what we get culture from, and it always, in the rest of the Old Testament, the Hebrew word there always is a tool using type of activity. And so I think God is saying essentially that the garden is there. It's kind of like he's dumped a box of Legos out and said, I just want to see what cool stuff you're going to make. Eventually you're going to find those rare metals in Africa and be able to make phones out of them, right? And so I think a lot of what we're doing today even is still fulfilling this creative mandate, or culture mandate, as it's sometimes called, that God is asking us to make and create things. But even in the garden, we don't see Adam and Eve making tools, but we do see God asking Adam to create language. And I think for developers and programmers, this is kind of important, because what we do with language shapes what we see and don't see about the world, right? So if these are like I was thinking about these in terms of emojis, but if we think about them in terms of what the words behind these two creatures represent, one of them, we think about it primarily in terms of what it does, and the other one, we think about it primarily in terms of how it looks. And so that kind of shows you a little bit about how words have this capacity to shape what we see and don't see about things. And of course, in political cycles and election cycles, we see this very, very powerfully. I think to some degree we see this in the current use of emojis, and how that's evolved, and how the early ones didn't have brown faces in it. And so it shaped what we thought about and what we really valued, because most of the tech workers were white guys, and so they didn't think to include anybody else in them. So that again, language has this shaping capacity. And even in our own language, we believe in the fullness of male and female both being created in the image of God. But I think that our language kind of makes one gender subservient to the other. So it's built in there, and our that's just built in just as the way that we talk, whether we say man and woman or we say male and female. I think this language kind of grates against what we think theologically. Whereas in other languages, a male is a blockhead and a woman is a curvy thing, right? There's things built in to our languages that tell us things that we kind of forget and don't realize. And even in our current language about how we speak about people, sometimes we emphasize particular things. So in one era, we emphasized someone as a maker, and in another era, we emphasize someone as primarily being a mom if she's choosing to do some type of homework instead of public work. And so I've watched my own wife as someone who does work outside the home and who does care for us and keep things, suffer kind of under these labels. So again, I think language is our most powerful and initial tool. And you see even today that based on whether or not you understand a particular technology and language, you're either in or you're out in a particular group. So if you don't get it language-wise, you're not in that. So even though we don't see creativity in terms of tools in the garden, I think we do see the power of language there as being our first initial tool. So then we get to the fall, right? And we have Adam and Eve eat from the forbidden fruit, and they choose to introduce sin and death into the world. But can you remember in the biblical story, they go and they run, what the very first thing they do as fallen creatures is?
They clothe themselves with leaves?
Yeah, they make clothes for themselves, right? And so I think again, we're seeing right away that Adam and Eve are expressing this creativity that they have, and we know sort of that there's this theological thing going on back there where they are trying to cover their sin with their own works, and God comes along and he takes some type of skin from some type of creature, and he puts it over them. And I think theologically we know that means that God is saying, for you to really be saved, it's going to take me doing something. It's going to take death and sacrifice to do this. So it looks forward to Jesus. But I think in another way, I think he's sanctioning them in this activity of making technology that overcomes some of the effects of the fall. And he's saying this is a good thing to build tools and to make things. So I think right there, right after they sin, God certainly curses the ground and all that kind of stuff, and he curses their sin, but he doesn't curse their creativity and their acts of making. So from Genesis 2 and 3 onward, we're seeing God really being excited about this. And so a lot of what we do can overcome some of the effects of the fall. Now, not everything, of course, and there's certainly other uses of technology just to explore creation. But I think this can be a good to try to use this way, and we see this really early on. At the same time, in the fall, we see people like Cain, who don't care for God. He wants to make his own anti-garden with the city. But even though he doesn't care about God, he still bears the image of God. And so from him and his people, we see music and art and tools and agriculture. And so I think all of us, you're probably surrounded with some of the most talented people in America, all of whom bear the image of God and who make amazing things. And I hope, hope some way that you can be able to show them why they have that creative drive, where that really comes from. But the temptation is, of course, to think that the technology itself is what's going to bring kind of this ultimate sort of salvation, rather than being a foreshadowing of Jesus, that it's something bigger than that. And so you see people like Nobel or the Wright brothers or Tesla or Descartes. All of these people would say things about one day technology will bring peace, and we see that's not really the way that it goes. That there's still this fallenness in humanity. However creative we are, there's this darkness there, and so there is a temptation, I think, to see technology become a god, either just the way we worship our phones in a simple way, or even the way that sometimes you hear, we were joking earlier about how Apple always makes everything seem like, it's going to change your life if you have one more megapixel or something like that all of a sudden you're going to become happy in those things. And I think in that way it can become a sort of false god. But thankfully, in the rest of the story, we see time and time again that these stories that we might tell our kids, like Noah and Noah's Ark, these are really stories about God using human creativity as part of the biblical story. So he could have, I think if God wanted to wipe out things with a flood, he could have just levitated Noah and his family. But instead, he says, I want you to make something, and I want your creativity to be part of my story of redemption. And we see this in the Tower of Babel and God coming in and sort of hacking that. We see this in the 10 Commandments, where the first commandment tells us something about God, and the second commandment tells us how we use media to teach that very thing about God, right? So that if Adam and Eve, if Moses had said, or if God had told Moses to make an idol that represented him, to say, this is the official Yahweh doll that you're supposed to buy, at Hebrew Mart or whatever, that would have said that God is just like all the other gods. But by making a judicious choice in how he uses media, God was actually able to use technology in the second commandment to reinforce the theology of the first commandment. And in fact, I take great encouragement in knowing that, it's not Abraham or Joseph or Moses where the Spirit of God first descends on a person in Scripture. It's actually this guy Bezalel who is charged with making kind of art and creativity that would represent who God is to a largely illiterate people. So I think he becomes kind of our patron saint of coding or of medicine or whatever it is, where we are creating things that I think shows something about God. So again, the point is just that God goes out of his way all through sort of the Old Testament to use human creativity in part of what he's doing. And we see this most obviously in Jesus, who this little Greek word tekton, from which we get our own word technology. But in Greek, it actually means an artisan or a craftsperson, someone who makes something with their hands. And so we translate that as carpenter because we think that that's what kind of artisan or craftsperson Jesus and his Father was. And so what I think is great about this is you have Jesus, the Son of God, creating humanity. Humanity turns on him, and then he works with wood and nails, and that's what is used to kill him. And so in both ways, the creation turns on the Creator, and yet the Creator somehow is able to redeem that and offer us, a kind of salvation that when we do have the chance to tell our story and the hope that we have, we can't tell it apart from this act of human creativity. Even though we took a God's creation of a tree and we twisted it into something dark, God is somehow able to redeem that. So again, the story of Scripture is replete with all these cases in which human creativity matters. And if we go into the end of the story in the restoration part, we see, not this vision of us going up to heaven in this kind of ethereal world where we just float around, but instead God bringing down a holy city full of roads and trumpets and banners, and maybe some of the things that some of you create there being part of the eschatology. So whatever the order of events and all that stuff is, in the end, God is bringing down human creativity, and someone has to make Jesus's throne. And so again, I think that this creativity will continue on into the eschaton, and hopefully some things we won't need anymore. There's maybe some medical devices that will hopefully be rendered obsolete, but then other kinds of technology and creativity will continue. And so as people like N.T. Wright would say, that what will become is not this less than human kind of ethereal being, but these more human things that continue to do the best of this world, just free from sin and destruction. So I think that gives us the opportunity to think about, man, as I use technology today, and as I create technology today, is it possible that I might create something that there would be some echo of that in the new heavens and the new earth? And I think that gives me a lot of joy to think, man, I sometimes I'm going to make things that just overcome something silly about the fall, but other times I think, man, this is the kind of thing that I think, maybe the physical Jesus would use when he returns. So again, God, I don't think in Scripture is interested in destroying technology, but in taking it and transforming it into objects of human flourishing, things that make human life the fullness of what he meant it to be. So that's kind of the God-given side of things. And then I'll try to kind of go through some transformative side of things and leave some time for us to talk about some questions. So one of the things I try to talk with average people about, but also with developers about, is this idea that anytime we use technology, that it shapes us. So I like to give an illustration of a shovel, where the usual assumption is just the shovel itself is neutral, and all that matters is how you use it. So you can use it for good things, or you can use it for bad things, and we could apply this to computers or whatever. But the reality is this: the reason why I don't think the shovel is even itself neutral is that when we use the shovel to do something like dig a hole, at the end of the day, whether we're using it for good or for bad, something happens to our hands, right? What happens to your hands after you use a shovel?
Calluses.
Yeah, you get blisters, and those turn into calluses. So maybe eventually you get sore, you get bigger muscles, whatever. But the point is that no matter what we're doing, the morality of our actions, whether we're building a church or axe murdering somebody, we still get blisters. So when we use technology always uses us at the same time. And it really doesn't matter how moral we're being. So morality is really important, but so is the transformative power of technology, even when we're not talking about morality. So we know this when we go into the gym, because we choose different types of tools based on how we want it to shape our bodies. But it's harder for us to think about this when it comes to our relationships, our minds, and our souls. So people like Billy Graham are great, but they're often saying that television, for example, is just neutral, when in reality we know that television religion is a different kind of a religion than in-person religion. And so we love Billy, we think he's great, we love a lot of things that he did, but I don't think talking this way about technology is helpful for us as Christians. You probably all heard this old phrase from old Marshall McLuhan from the 60s, the medium is the message. I like to try to illustrate this with this wonderful slide. Tell me if you can see the slide yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you agree, if this was my very first slide, Andrew had just introduced me, would you believe what the slide said?
No.
Okay, well, what makes you say no?
Yeah. Font
What's
choice.
that? Yeah. Comic Sans and Papyrus, the worst fonts ever. Spelling, yeah. Are you appreciating the contrast? No, right? So what's that?
It's almost unreadable.
Almost unreadable. Yeah, exactly. So the idea here is that there's a message in words, right? That I'm good at PowerPoint, but that the medium of PowerPoint and all the things that we're using right now is actually telling you something different, right? That you're picking up all these other cues, so that the medium is becoming a message. And in this case, they're in conflict, and the message from the medium is overpowering the message itself, right? And so all of technology is doing this to us all the time. It's always has like a secondary message that's going alongside of whatever explicit message you're saying. And so we say this about people all the time, that the medium and the message can be in conflict, right? Where you don't really buy what that person's saying. But, when we talk to our kids, we say that, 90% of communication is all of these other things about you that people are going to understand, whether or not this "I love you" is an apology, or it's a goodbye statement, or it's maybe said in a mocking way. We learn all of this from all of these other factors than just the words themselves. But then, of course, as we change technology, we lose some of these things about ourselves, and we gain some of the priorities of the device. And sometimes this is excellent, right? I mean, this is what makes telecommunications so great. This is what gets us sports scores, and we can call 911, all that kind of stuff. But of course, if we continue to change technology, we lose more and more of ourselves, and we gain more and more of the device. And sometimes there's that potential for conflict, right? And so we've all had the email that was misunderstood, or the text that was misunderstood. And to some degree, I think some of the video stuff that we're doing right now can overcome some of this, but never completely, right? So just being aware that mediums tend to communicate something. And Akulin is saying something deeper than just this. I mean, he's saying that when a medium comes into a culture, that it becomes its own kind of message, right? So that the internet itself is a message about the way we should live our lives, and how we should order products, and how we should watch television, and all of that stuff, and how we should vote, and how we should get news. That is the more powerful effect of the internet than any messages that are on it. But the way that it reshapes our lives, that becomes the message of a particular medium. So I'm gonna skip this one. This is just a phone study about when you have a phone out in front of people, when they're having a conversation. There was a psychology study, and basically if there's a phone on the table versus a book on the table, when the phone's out there, people end up saying at the end of the conversation that they feel depressed. And the idea is that this isn't even the person's phone. Nobody's receiving a call. It's not buzzing. It's just that the presence of the phone there communicates the message that the world out there is more important in this conversation. So these particular psychologists would say that it's very important to recognize that if you want to have a close relationship with somebody, you need to be in kind of this media neutral environment where people feel like they can trust you, and that you're not always checking the buzzes and all that kind of stuff. So as much as I'm tempted to, I would really like to buy the new iPhone watch that has LTE and get rid of my phone. But I don't know if that would make the problem better or worse, right, for relationships. We'll have to see. Thankfully, in the scriptures, they are also struggling with these same things. So at the end of 2nd and 3rd John, we see them talking about the communication technology of their day, paper and ink, versus face-to-face, and saying that both are valuable, but valuable for different things. So if we didn't use any communication technology, we wouldn't have the scriptures. But if we didn't have face-to-face, then we also would lose some certain things. So Paul makes the opposite argument to the Corinthians. He says, I wanted to come to you, but I was so mad at you for all the things you were doing. I just wanted to punch you in the face. So I thought I would write a letter, because that would be more redemptive, right? So we need to have the ability to make good choices, right? Or use, Gary Smalley's book about the 5 love languages, thinking about what does the other person need, and thinking about how would we communicate to them. So this is basic workplace stuff about how to deal with conflict, about how to do effective brainstorming and creativity, knowing that sometimes that does better face-to-face, but other kinds of things do much better online. But being savvy about how we use media is important in business, and I think in the church. So I want to skip over a few of these and just talk about a little bit more about our mind and our soul, and then come to that. So if we think about old technology as being primarily physical, modern technology is primarily this mental and soul stuff. So there's this old phrase that technology is always an extension of who we are, that the telescope extends our eyes, and a microphone extends our voice, and a car extends our legs in some way. But at the same time, the more we use it, technology becomes an amputation of our humanity. So that I have a faint voice, and I have to have a microphone to speak to people, and I'm utterly dependent on it, right? And I probably am dependent on a whole host of technologies I don't even see. But this idea that whatever it extends, it also tends to amputate. And when we think about activities like reading, my wife, I mentioned, is a literature professor, and so she gave me a list of the best books ever written, from the Greek classics to the Bible to Augustine and Dostoevsky. And so I did a little program to write up the number of words that those were. And then I looked at a basic social media activity just a couple times a day, and realizing that that's more words, right? And so we all know that we can do the thing on the right, whatever our favorite social media platform is, but we can't do the thing on the left, right? So why is that?
Focus.
Focus, yeah.
Our love for connection.
Yeah. Maybe the one on the right feels a little bit more relational in some way. Yeah.
Facebook's been engineered to be addictive.
Yeah,
So.
that's true. Yeah, they are testing the algorithms constantly, right? And Dostoevsky, as far as I know, is still dead, so he's not changing his book. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of what you're saying there is that the the kind of text that we read, each little bit is not connected to the previous bit, so they're all decontextualized and you can take them all in. But when you think about a computer screen, right? There's like menu buttons along the top, and there's all these different interface things, and there's ads. We're basically training ourselves to ignore and scan when we read. So when we read a social media feed, we're not really reading; we're just scanning for words that we like, And so that activity is kind of like, maybe you would say, like sprinting as opposed to marathon running. You're just training your mind to be good at two different things. And so it doesn't really matter the morality of these things, right? Whether or not you read, all Stephen King novels or all Faulkner novels, you're training your mind in a particular kind of reading that's different from the morality. And whether or not you just follow a bunch of celebrities online, or Ted Cruz or something like that, you may or may not get good moral content. But that moral content is relevant. But I think what's even more relevant is the kind of behaviors that we're doing and what we're training our minds to do. So we see this with GPS, right? Whenever you use GPS to get somewhere, and then you have to use it again the next time, and the next time, because your mind refuses to forget. So you're just trying to decide what kind of mind do I want to shape, and then ultimately what kind of soul do I want to shape. And so this is the soul part at the end to be thinking through, is that if our natural voice allows us to talk to a couple people, and technology allows us to communicate to a lot of people, what you often see is those articles about technology is making us stupid, right? Or Google is making us stupid, or Facebook is making us narcissistic, and we tend to blame the tool for that. But I think what's probably better to do is to go with what Jesus was saying, is that when something comes out of the mouth that's negative, that's coming from the heart, and that's the root issue. And so technology itself doesn't force you to do that. And yet it is worth talking about how newer technology does afford things to us that we didn't have before. So if we think about, gambling or something like that, if we're at one particular kind of store, it doesn't affect us. But if we're at a casino, then the casino doesn't make you gamble, but it opens up that possibility, right? It affords gambling to you. And so you could do this with any number of different kind of issues that you have. And I think one of these things would be if you struggle with self-focus and self-validation, and you're in the car and you have a phone, then you're going to want to look at that. Whereas if you didn't have a phone, you wouldn't necessarily need to do that. So again, I think this gives us some language to talk about technology with people in ways that doesn't have to blame the tool, but says, okay, the tool does give us something new. So if we were going to say, why is modern technology so much more difficult? It's because it connects to all these different parts of us, and it gets deeper, kind of gets its hooks deeper into our soul. And so technology can come, closer and closer and closer to us, depending on what we're doing. So whether it's social media or fake things that we do online, all of these things have this kind of soul capacity. So the last one is just to think about it in kind of more theological terms, to think about how our hearts have this tendency, when Paul talks about the flesh, what he means by that is that our tendency to become self-directed. And so it's this phrase from Augustine is the incurvature of the soul toward the self. And I think that modern technology does a really good job of giving us options to customize for ourselves. And it can kind of inculcate that behavior of self-directed love as opposed to outwardly directed love. So I think one of the things that we can do in making technology is trying to think about how can we make things that are community oriented, that are directed toward the other instead of always self-directed, that we can do activities together. So again, just being sober and being vigilant, just realizing that this isn't all just bits and bytes, that there is spiritual forces at work underneath all of these things. I'm going to skip screen time and time that you spend on your phone and all that kind of stuff. And, I think one possibility that we can model really well is the way that we do rest in our own communities, in our own life, and modeling that in the way that we work, and taking time off and trying to figure out how to shut out email. And sometimes that's not an option in work. I think just depending on how that is, but still trying to figure out a way to have a pattern of rest in our lives can be really, really important. So I can put up a couple of things here that we can talk through if we want to, but I'll just put this up, and I'll stop it for now and just say maybe we should just kind of have some dialogue and see what you think and what else we can talk about.
Yeah, thanks, John. This is
Sure.
Awesome.
John, could you put the takeaways back just so we kind of see
Yeah,
where we've been? Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
Here's just a couple things to think about. I mean, just remembering this idea of the non-neutrality of technology. So this doesn't mean that we're saying technology is inherently bad or good, but we're just saying it's this sort of transformative power that has sometimes values one group over another, and sometimes values one activity over another. But at the same time, to just remember that this reflects the image of God, and this is part of what God is asking us to do. So what our profession is something that's very connected to the image of God and to what God would want for us. And the third one, the moral things that are direct, like sort of cyberbullying, pornography versus Bibles or something like that. Those are good, and I think really important. But looking at some of the more subtle things, I think can help us also see more subtle moral things, like how putting an interstate through a particular community may privilege one group over the other, and often those have racial and socioeconomic lines. So we're able to get to deeper morality by thinking through those types of things. And I think number 4, just thinking carefully about how we use media and all media in our own lives, and how we use that to shape our homes and what kinds of communities we want to have. And then finally, using technology in redemptive ways while not confusing it for a false savior. And then I think the last one is that you really can't learn about technology without experimenting. So it's fun to talk about, but until you've tried it, I don't think you really know. And so trying that in communities of people who are willing to evaluate, famously the Amish are the ones who are so good at this, right? They're not anti-technology. They don't immediately go buy iPhone X, right? They wait a little bit, and then they have one person buy it, and they evaluate it as a group and decide whether or not they want to incorporate it. So I think doing that can be really powerful. So.
Yeah, John, this is great. I've heard your talk probably various versions of your talk 10 times probably, and each time it gets better. So I think you are at the iPhone X now. So, and I know that normally your talk's a little bit longer, but I appreciate you making it shorter so we can have some more time for discussion.
Sure.
So I think we have a lot of people here who think pretty passionately about this stuff. So I'd love to just open it up for questions that you guys have for John. I mean, I think what he really presents is, John, he's a theologian in addition to a technologist. Maybe he probably wouldn't call himself that, but he has his MDiv, and he can write programs about Greek and Hebrew that, is a part of this. So I think that's a big part of what he brings, is this big picture theology of technology. So what sort of questions do you guys have? Go ahead.
Well, John, I'd be interested in that last point that you were talking about. And one of the things that I'm most concerned about is the community and how a community responds to this. I think it's the temptation is to think, okay, well, go take this home and work on it on your own. But what I see in Scripture and in church history is that these things are tackled as a community. At the same time, as you were saying earlier, a pastor is not necessarily going to be in a position to answer a lot of these questions. The typical church hierarchy might not be in a position to answer these things. How do we work as a community to develop the disciplines as a community that will help us to use these things in godly ways?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if any of you are in, I'm not sure what religious traditions you come from, but if you come from sort of broader evangelicalism, one of the great things about evangelicalism is concern for Scripture and activism and conversion and all those things. But one of the subtle things that I think is hard about it is that evangelicals tend to be very utilitarian in their approaches to things. So they're just willing to kind of use whatever gets them to whatever ends they want. And so they're going to focus on ends and kind of ignore the means for that. So like if you know you have to do communion every once in a while because you're supposed to, then you're just going to do it in the fastest, most efficient, most machine-like way, right? Just to get the job done, you know. And in fact, I personally think that that is one of the, you know, the practices that God gives us that is profoundly technological, right? He didn't ask us to use grapes and grain. He asked us to use a product of human creativity to represent, you know, the salvation that we have and to receive His grace, depending on kind of how you construe that. But it ends up being the most, you know, inefficient and slow process that we have. And I think it's something that people really want. They want to come to church for something different than they can get at an Apple store. As wonderful, or I don't think they call it stores anymore. They call it town halls. I found out today, but you know, yeah. So I think that's one of the hard things about being in evangelicalism is because we don't want to talk about these kind of things because we just want to get to whatever ends that we want. So taking a step back and thinking about, you know, our worship space, what does it value? What does it say is important there? And thinking through all those kinds of things and the way that we run, you know, small groups and all that stuff. So I think you could do it at just about every level. One of the other things though is that you know how you often hear this thing that like the Bible talks about money more than almost any other subject. I think if you like drop out money and you put in technology in almost every one of those passages, you get a very similar effect, you know, because money is not like, as you know, sort of inherently good or bad, but it is also not neutral. If you have money, you have one set of choices. If you don't, you have another set of choices. And so thinking through that can be, you know, really, really helpful, you know, and encouraging your pastor to just sort of like subtly drop hints that he or she, you know, is in the know when he or she is teaching, even if it's just like open your Bibles to or scroll to, you know, and just kind of using that language. We're acknowledging the world in which we live. And so I think when we're talking about, you know, relationships or any of those things, there's so many places where it comes up. But again, I think we tend to get pretty defensive and guarded about it because we don't want anyone to, you know, step on our toes. But I think starting with sort of small groups can be really helpful, and doing experiments. Sometimes what I usually have students do is sometimes do a negative experiment, like don't use Facebook for a week or whatever thing you want to, kind of fasting type thing. But I also have them do like you know, trying something new on and seeing what that's like and reflecting on that in community, whether that's starting a new blog or, you know, a new Instagram account, or starting like, you know, using like a Calm or some type of 10-minute meditation app or something like that, or reading the Bible in audio, or just doing something, but doing it in a way that you're reflectively working. So your whole small group is built around the idea of let's all try something and reflect on it over the course of 8 or 9 weeks. So it's not just you doing your own thing. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Yeah, no, that's great. Good. Other questions that people have? I mean, whenever you, and maybe another way to frame it is, what are you wrestling with as technologists, you know? You're in this world of technology and you're trying to follow Jesus. There's tension. And what are the challenges? So yeah, what are those things? Because I think what John has is a good big picture theology, but I'd like to hear it applied to like specific, you know, situations you guys have. So what are the big challenges or questions that you might have?
Well, so one thing I think about is we talk about like the dehumanization that technology seems to bring, and it's the paradox, because we would, like John, we wouldn't be able to talk to you tonight if we didn't have this Zoom meeting. And you know, this is incredible, right? You don't have to leave your home, and you might be in your pajamas for all we know. So it's a fantastic, you know, benefit. But I find in the work that I do is that my soul is looking for more of an interpersonal, like even this room here, to have this room of people to have conversation is so much different than if we were to say everyone logged in at the same time and look at the screen, and you know, so I just to state the challenge of how technology has seemed to dehumanize a little bit. Perhaps how can the body of Christ respond to that effect without it being the technology is bad sort of thing, and people feel like, oh no, it's bad, everyone shouldn't have, you know, you shouldn't have technology because it is bad. But how do we I guess maybe have a vision for something greater? I don't know if that challenge makes sense to anyone. But.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're bringing up the challenge that is, how much we are able to say that there's these kind of values of the gospel and the kingdom that sometimes are at odds with sort of like the American dream, consumerism, go faster, individualism, all that kind of stuff. And so I think when we just focus on the device, right? When we just say, everybody's addicted to their phones, we should do that less. People kind of just react. But when we kind of take a step back and we're like, okay, so what does your life really like? I mean, does it have, peace and joy? And what about that isn't just about like how much money you make and that kind of thing, but what is the structure in your life, and really being able to take a step back and looking at that. But I think that requires, intimacy and the willingness to share that goes beyond just, what do you think this verse means to you, right? You have to really be willing to look at sort of the deeper patterns there. And I don't know how much that you can do always from the pulpit, but I think you can push that. But I do think you can do it in small groups of communities, and I think even possibly at your work. I mean, I know you mentioned at the Coder. I think you mentioned that you do the kind of these technology implementations, right? And it may be that there's an opportunity just to sort of like drop a hint that like we do want to think through how this brings some efficiencies, but we do want to think about the human side of what this is going to do. And I don't want to get you fired, right? And say, that you should say like, well, actually we should do this because of the human loss. But, being able to be the person who's willing to sort of bring that up may be a really redemptive role in what you do. I don't know if that's kind of what you think about, but.
Yeah. Yeah. What about other people?
Okay, yeah, no, for me, this is like, there's nothing to do at all with my work, but no, so I currently volunteer with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at MIT, and so like, there was a system that someone made couple of years ago to help like following up with students during like outreach periods. And this tool is like great. It helps you like organize things and everything like that. It's a beautiful system, but in some ways, I wonder if this first time using it, if like it makes things, I don't know, too efficient or too like unpersonal.
Yeah.
I've talked with some of the students, and I want to talk with more of them, but the idea that like even with delivering care packages to people, like before it took like a lot of like work, and you had to go over there and deliver it to them. If the person wasn't there, you had to be willing to go again and stuff like that. But now you kind of shoot an email, hopefully they respond. If they do, you ask when they're going to be there, and you go and try to deliver. And like even the concept like visiting a person who lives like 6 doors down from you multiple times just seems so inefficient nowadays. I'm like, you literally like this person like a floor away from you. You can just see if they're in their room like 3 times, like 2 minutes to walk up there. But these are things that I know, like even as a college student when I was there, like these are things you get like lazy about. And technology makes things a lot more efficient. When some ways I wonder if it like takes the heart away from some things and makes it to where you're like less willing to, I don't know, put in work for what God wants you to do instead of just like doing it the simplest way possible.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what you're talking about is the idea of the ends and the means, right? So we all realize that care packages are a good ends to achieve, but we kind of forget that sometimes the different means by which we achieve that goal can actually become a bigger goal in and of itself, right? So that the act of walking down there and seeing other people, and they see what it's like that you're in InterVarsity, and InterVarsity does this. All those other things can be just as important as the end, right? And so sometimes recognizing that and saying that, surely there's times when a well-timed text message is really, really helpful and really can be so meaningful to you. But sometimes doing the work of writing a handwritten note can, even though it's exact same words, can send some other entirely different message. Just like if you go downtown for a date and you get the old horse and buggy, somehow it just feels a lot more magical than Uber. Sometimes the means change things. So thinking that through with people, I think, is a really good thing. And you're not demonizing the system or saying that it's bad. You're just trying to actually do more and maybe alter it. So I think that's a great observation, and keep that up. So.
Okay. I was curious about, I really like the image you had of technology and people, and then pessimism, or like the negative and the positive. And then in the center you had hopeful realism, and then social construction of technology, and I think one other really packed title of something. And so I was curious, I think I can oscillate kind of through all of those. You know, I'll see one technology and I'll have a warning flag pop up and I'm like, let's stay away from that. Or I'll see another thing and it might even be the same technology, like a database structure or something. And I'm like, I could do so much with this other idea that I'm thinking about right now. And so I'm curious, could you, I don't know if it's easy to role play of a time where you help somebody that's in a firm technology, I love technology spot, and pull them back towards the human side, or vice versa, somebody that's like in the
Instrumentalism? Yeah.
Yeah. I think MSBS in it, and pull them into, well, that's good, but like this thing could actually help. Like, how do you stay in the center of hopeful realism?
Yeah, I think it's by acknowledging kind of really both those sides really deeply. So I'll give you like a just where we are, like as a seminary. You know, we love being. I mean, I love being with students in person. It's just like what you guys are experiencing there. I wish I was there. It's great. And yet, you know, there's such a deep value for online ed for seminary students, because it's people like, say, if any of you guys decide to go and keep working at university and you decide you want to get some classes that you couldn't get at your church, then that would be really, really great. But there are also some downsides to it. And so I think when we've had some, say, for example, professors that are like, man, all that internet stuff, that's just terrible. You know, you never would want to be distant from somebody and use communication technology. And I'm like, that's kind of what Paul did, you know, like that was sort of his whole strategy, was to like be with people for a couple of weeks and then like use technology to communicate with them. So, you know, we can kind of push somebody along there to realize how education actually works, that, you know, really we only have like an hour with them in the classroom, and then we ask them to spend like 3 hours with dead guys reading their papers. You know, that's a pretty discarnate activity as well. So that's been good on that side. But then on the other side, there's been some, you know, who, for example, I think one of the ones would be like there's a lot of folks down where I am that's a little bit more kind of Bible belty than Boston, where they're doing all the, you know, satellite church type stuff, you know, where they beam the super pastor out to all these different locations, and just kind of thinking through what are the subtle secondary messages that you get from that, you know, so that on one hand it says like that one of the positives is that they can hire a pastor each of those people and at each of those campuses, and rather than spending a whole week preparing for some kind of sermon that they're going to give, that person can be spending time with people, and then the beamed guy can be the one that's actually spending time teaching. So that's a neat value. On the other hand, you know, it can say that we don't value, you know, training new people to teach, you know, in those things. So walking through what is, it's kind of that medium in the message thing earlier, that talking through that kind of satellite church sends all kinds of other messages that go beyond whatever it is that you're saying about the Bible. It says all kinds of other things about what you value and don't value. So those have been some of the kinds of things that we talked about. So.
Yeah, that's good. Other questions that people have? Alice, do you have anything? Who else had it on?
Alice, were you the one that said you were working in biomedical work?
Yeah.
Okay. What are you seeing some interesting things there that you wonder about with technology and, I don't know, end of life scenarios? I don't know what it is.
Sure. I mean, what did you mention? CRISPR, right? That's hot in the news these days. And my church actually had a discussion about stem cell research years ago. So there are definitely a lot of these frontiers that we're crossing that merit a lot of thinking through, and
Yeah. I feel like with a lot of those things that they will come, and so it's more like operating within them. I don't know if there's anything you can do to stop them. You know, someone's going to do it somewhere, and then they're going to come. You know, and so I think thinking that through and how, you know, where you might make a choice as a believer not to operate in that might be important. But I don't think that like trying to stop, you know, and have a culture war is going to work in a lot of those fields. I don't know if you feel the same way or if you think you could stop some of it or whatever.
No, I agree. It can't be stopped, and you just need to, be thoughtful about how to do it, and then keep the conversation going and educate, right, the church to how to think through things and what it means to be. And it really gets down to what it means to be human, right? A lot of this medical advances, as well as AI and technology advances.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of times, a lot of our technology ends up functioning a lot like a mirror, that the deeper we look at it, the more we see something in ourselves or what we value about ourselves reflected. So it asks these questions about what does it mean to be human, and what do I really think? And I think those discussions can be valuable, even if you can't necessarily change the technology itself, but you can understand yourself and society better.
Yeah. Ken, do you have any questions?
I have a stupid question.
Stupid.
It's easy to say we should be thoughtful about tech and such. How practically can we go about this process of being thoughtful?
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're right. That's always, it's great. You have all these fun things you can put on a slide, but and you can talk about it when you swish a cocktail or something like that. But you go like, what do I really do with this? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes.
Good. Yeah. So I think at the individual level, right, you can make these choices about how you're going to use, social media, and can I do it in a way that is follows Micah's word? Can I, love justice and walk humbly before our God and love mercy? Can I do that? Can I embody that in my own personal usage? I think that part's not super hard to think about. But figuring out how to do that at more of like a communal church level, that's where it really requires some kind of bumping up against each other and bothering each other and pushing on those things. And we're, like I said, we're good at talking about Bible verses and stuff like that. It's harder to challenge one another in our own actions. So those people who are closest to us usually know our own personal habits best, and asking them, honestly, like I got to ask my kids, like, is this how you view daddy? Right. The back of the phone, they know that best, better than anyone else. So then at that level, and then I think then we kind of move out from, ourselves to our kind of closer nuclear, smaller, whether that's a family or closer friends or roommates or whatever, and then out to church. And then I think at work, if you're depending on if you run your own company and you're able to do the kinds of things that you want to do, or if you're someone who is working at another level, but being able to occasionally bring these kinds of things up about thinking through things without just valuing, like if you sit down and you say, like, what do we value as a company? Do we value efficiency and speed and productivity and bottom line, versus do we have some way of quantifying, valuing people and flourishing, or some kind of word like that? And if you have some categories like that, then you have a new grid to evaluate whether or not this product is successful or not. So like we could say, Apple, for example, they don't have to do everything with sustainable energy, right? They don't have to I guess try to make a whole campus with renewable energy, but that's something that they value, and you can see that put out there. Now, we all pay $1,000 for the phone in order for them to have that renewable energy, but I think at least you're seeing some different values than other companies that might just value efficiency. So I think being the kind of people that put forward values that are more closely aligned with the kingdom of God, and then seeing if those if you can put some kind of businessy spin on those and use those within your company can be helpful. Does that make sense? Give you some broad, vague outline.
I think so. So John, I'm going to jump in with a question here.
Okay.
And I'm going to go ahead and share a screen. So I shared some last week, and I shared this slide here that kind of goes through some of the different groups that are focused on technology. And I'm trying to see if this is, maybe try that one. Yeah, let me share a different screen. I don't know if there's a way I can choose what screen I share.
I did see it.
You brought it to share screen, it brought an option of windows to share.
It did. Okay, so let me try that again. Oh, desktop too.
No, the bottom left.
Yeah, I see it. I got it. Okay, so let me just share this so that you can see it now. So there's this growing movement for Christians in technology. You got networks nationally, like Christian Engineering Society, faculty networks. You got technology and mission. You've probably given talks. It's probably like Don Dyer's talk list, some of these things, right? Technology and education, online evangelism, and mobile, evangelism. There's this new movement of Metro Christian Tech Hubs, and I think what we're doing here is part of it. Silicon Valley Prayer Breakfast. Have you connected with the Faith Tech guy?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Then there's these hackathons. So I think the key question that I have for you is, I look at the theology of work movement, and I kind of feel like where we are is we're still like, what that was in the 70s. Like theology of work now, you can call it a movement. What we're, this is right now, I don't think it's a movement. It's kind of like a minor shift. It could become a movement or something. But, part of, I think, your thesis is saying that, okay, there's pastors, but they're the generalists. You need specialists. And how do we mobilize this movement more is kind of the key question that I would have for you. And you're one of the, main go-to keynoters on this. So, I mean, what are your thoughts around that? I mean,
Yeah.
I
think I've really appreciated James and the Faith Tech guys, probably of a lot of them, because I think all those first couple of bullet points that are more about using technology to do some kingdom ended thing, whether that's evangelism or whatever, and those are all valuable. And in a sense, that's what I do down at Dallas Seminary. But I think that the Faith Tech guys, what I've appreciated about them is really trying to focus on people who are working, in the tech industry and trying to just be around them in some helpful way. So the kinds of events they've been doing, I think, are great. I enjoy the hackathons and those things too, but I just think I'd love to see that network expand quite a bit, just because I think he's creating some great space to reflect. And there's a couple of the Faith at Work institutes, like the Denver Faith at Work one. They have a pretty strong tech contingent. So I think it's called the denverinstitute.org. And they do a lot down in Boulder, where there's a nice little tech startup group. And I think they've been focused on that community in a good way. I haven't seen as much. I was with a little group that did some stuff down at a Google campus and some other areas. And I know that there's groups like this on that Redmond campus, and I don't know as much on at Apple, but there's some internally. So I think there are a bunch of the groups about just using technology for ministry, but there's not as many that are doing thinking through the theology of work specifically for tech workers, and that's what I love about the Faith Tech group.
Yeah. I know that there's a big Google Christians, like I guess it's X, and with an X group, and my understanding is there's hundreds or maybe even over 1,000 people on this in Google, and it's kind of a thriving community, which you wouldn't guess. But Google, part of their support of all communities is they, are very supportive of Christian communities and Jewish communities and whatever communities. But have you seen anything like that at Microsoft?
Yeah, there's a group on the Redmond campus, Microsoft, like Marketplace for Missions or something. I forget which one it is. I know a couple of guys. A couple of people in that. I've gone to a couple of things when they did between full-time and interns. They had a couple of that. I don't think it's definitely not in the thousands, as far as I know, at least on the Redmond office, that group itself. There are also like multiple groups, but that's the one that I know that's like the biggest. I think it might be in the order of 100 or 100.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Cool.
In like in terms of.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, part of what I think about, like I read a lot of history and I think about, well, how these things start is they start really small and you got to push the ball forward a little bit. So part of what I think about is what is our role here, right? Where could it be in 40 years? I don't know, but we each are trying to do something, right? And so that's one question that I'd have for you, John. But the other one is, have you thought about a second book in can I give a plug for something? I think it's the integration of theology of work with this. Man, there's a ton of people who are wrestling with that. I guess there's a lot of ways you could go, but if you thought about doing another book, and if you did, what are some of the variants, that you'd do?
Yeah, right now I'm just trying to finish my, PhD dissertation to get that done. So I'm kind of finished with that stuff.
Yeah, it's
And,
kind of a book.
What's that? What'd you say?
That's a book in itself.
Yeah, but probably a little bit more boring, right? So not super fun.
Publish a book. It's just a book.
Even my mom and my professor probably won't actually ever read it. So, we're just gonna get that stuff done. Yeah. But I do think that question of like, how do I practically do anything with this is good. The hard thing is that I think so much of it is that kind of situational ethics that you have to have in your situation. You can't just lay out here's the 5 principles and everybody can apply that. You have to have like the Spirit of God giving you wisdom in your situation that you understand best. And so I think that being I guess holding the Bible in one hand and your iPad in the other, and being able to have the Spirit of God give you discernment with both of those things in your given situation is what's going to be important. So I would love it again, like if there was some fancy book that would principalize everything, but I just don't think that's the way it works. So I think you have to learn in the doing of the technology in it. And even if you wrote something perfect today, then it would change tomorrow.
Well, one thing, just to follow up with that, John, it seems to me that, I'm not sure if everybody appreciates, but I want to say it, even if it's obvious to everybody else, you have condensed so much in there. Every minute that you spend in your presentation could easily be extrapolated into, 10 or 15 minutes of discussion and things. And so the question I want to ask is, how could we kind of, do you have a suggested way of kind of going back and trying to digest the force feeding that you gave us there?
Yeah.
It was absolutely great, but it just, my mind was just reeling, and I've even heard a lot of this from you before. So it's really great. How can we break that into chewable bites?
Yeah, some of that stuff is written in the book form, right? Some of the basic idea about walking through the basic outline of the biblical story, some of that stuff is there. I'm happy to send you like a PDF of those slides if you want to just be able to scan through them and try to remember what you remember. That might be helpful. And then trying to how you always want to like watch one and then try to do one and then teach one, right? Trying to set up something at your church where you're going to go, hey, I want to try to give this basic idea that the scriptures, God really cares about human creativity. He cares about our souls and he cares about resurrecting our bodies, but I think he also cares about resurrecting the things that we make, right? That's part of the whole story. And it's baked in everywhere, getting that across, but then also getting across this transformation thing where it is good to think about morality. God cares about our holiness, but also caring about the more subtle things. And I think that's the thing that kind of opens up for people the way of thinking about technology in a non-threatening way. That's why I use the shovel illustration, right? Because nobody cares if you talk about shovels, but if you come right out and talk about phones, they get real defensive. So using some of that stuff can be just helpful ways of getting people to just reconsider their lives and reconsider all of it. So yeah, if you want me to send you along some of those slides, I'm happy to.
Yeah,
by all means.
And I don't know if you're open to posting them on SlideShare or something like that. That would be awesome or whatever you think format works best. You're the technologist, that you can do the analysis of the pros and cons of the different technology formats, right?
Right. There's no really good system for like video and slides that's like a YouTube of video and slides, unfortunately. So
yeah.
Well, guys, I think I've got I'm near bedtime for kiddos, so I got to probably head out.
Yeah. I'll let you get down for your kids. Thank you, John, for taking off the time. I really appreciate that. And
appreciate it.
I plan to post this on YouTube, so we'll send you the link, and you can add it to your collection. But yeah, thanks a lot, John. This is awesome.
All right, have a good one. God bless y'all.
All right, thank you, John.